We see so much dysfunction globally, political splits, economic gaps. But have you ever stopped to think, what if the roots go deeper than the usual explanations? Something maybe evolutionary.
That's exactly where we're headed today. It's a challenging concept, definitely. We're exploring whether these systemic issues, especially around race, could actually be tied to very old survival strategies.
Strategies playing out over vast stretches of time.
Right. We'll be pulling from biology, a bit of psychology, history, too, to try and, unpack this.
Yeah, the material we've been looking at really dives into that, focusing particularly on the historical relationship between white and black populations. It suggests that, to really get a handle on why these inequalities persist, we might need to factor in this deep evolutionary past.
So this deep dive, it's really for you if you're looking for a different angle on these persistent societal problems. We're trying to connect some dots between fields that maybe don't always talk to each other.
Hoping for some aha moments, maybe.
Hopefully. By linking biology, psychology, history, seeing if a new picture emerges.
Okay, so our mission today: explore this specific theory, the idea that systemic racial inequality could have roots in evolutionary survival tactics, and this concept of ancestral memory. And crucially, ask if we can actually move beyond these patterns.
Sounds good. So maybe a good starting point is a basic biological idea. The predator-prey relationship.
Right, like the classic wolf and rabbit example you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. One hunts, the other is hunted. It's a fundamental dynamic in nature, driving evolution behavior.
So the initial thought is, can we kind of use that dynamic, maybe metaphorically, to understand human group tensions, especially historical ones, like between racial groups?
Metaphorically is the key word there. The core idea we're examining suggests that while it can shed some light on historical power imbalances and psychological tensions, it's really problematic if you try to lock entire racial groups into fixed predator or prey roles.
Because that reflects history, the power structures people built, not some inherent biology.
Precisely. It reflects who had the power to define the relationship, essentially. Humans have complex societies, morality, empathy. It's not just raw instinct like in the animal kingdom.
We're not usually talking literal hunting and being hunted in human societies.
Not usually, no, but that fundamental drive for survival, that's still there. And in human societies, power, economic power, social status, institutional control can function in a way that parallels predation.
How so?
Well, the group holding power might not be literally consuming the other group, but their control over resources, laws, opportunities. It can absolutely threaten the well-being, the autonomy, even the survival prospects of the less powerful group.
So the prey in this human context are those groups made vulnerable, exploited, marginalized.
Exactly. And when you look at specific historical contexts, like the relationship between white and black populations through slavery, colonialism, segregation,
it's hard not to see that dynamic playing out. The control of resources, defining laws, maintaining power imbalances.
Indeed. There is a clear objectification, treating people as property, systematically denying autonomy. Black populations were forced into that subordinate, prey-like position.
And their resistance, their cultural survival, fighting for equality, those become survival mechanisms within this framework.
Powerful survival mechanisms, absolutely. Resilience in the face of immense, sustained pressure.
Okay, so that brings in the psychological dimension, too. The material suggests that sustained fear, living under that kind of pressure generation after generation, it can evolve.
It can evolve into deep-seated mistrust, even animosity, yeah. It's framed as a kind of psychological adaptation to persistent intergenerational trauma.
Like an inherited wariness.
You could think of it like that. Just as prey animals might have an instinctive fear, human groups can develop a collective psychological defense against recurring harm. It's not superficial. It runs deep.
And on the other side, for the dominant group,
well, the discussion touches on cognitive dissonance. To justify holding that power, to rationalize the inequality, there might be a tendency to dehumanize the other group, or even rewrite history a bit, downplay the severity of past actions.
It avoids confronting uncomfortable truths.
It can, yes. But we absolutely have to stress the limits of this predator-prey analogy for humans.
Right, you mentioned that it's not a perfect one-to-one mapping.
Far from it. Humans have moral reasoning. We have empathy, at least the capacity for it. We build complex social systems. And critically, race itself isn't a biological category like species are. It's a social construct.
And power isn't fixed forever. Things can change. Shifts can happen.
Exactly. Social movements, political action, changes in consciousness, these can alter those dynamics in ways you don't typically see in animal predator-prey relationships.
The source material also throws in a bit of a curveball, questioning this whole idea of human superiority.
Ah, yes. The point being, if our supposedly advanced cognitive abilities have led to things like environmental destruction, mass suffering, maybe even setting ourselves up for potential crises, how superior is that really?
Compared to animals living more in balance.
Precisely. It questions the assumption that our kind of intelligence is the ultimate evolutionary success story, especially if it undermines our own long-term survival or the planet's health.
Which then loops back to this really interesting, maybe uncomfortable hypothesis about animosity. Could hostility towards, say, black populations have roots in an ancestral memory within the dominant group, a memory of being the prey?
It's definitely a provocative line of thought. The idea is that if you look back far enough, groups now considered white weren't always dominant. Think about early Germanic tribes in the Romans, or European serfdom under feudal lords, or even Viking raids causing widespread fear.
So traumas from a distant past.
Experiences of subjugation, yeah. The hypothesis suggests that while these aren't conscious memories, maybe they leave a kind of psychological or even epigenetic imprint, a latent fear passed down, perhaps, of that power dynamic being reversed.
Wow. So the construct of whiteness itself,
Yeah.
could it have emerged partly from that? From a place of needing to control, to avoid feeling vulnerable again, based on some deep, unremembered past?
That's the speculation, that maintaining dominance becomes almost an existential need, a defense mechanism against slipping back into that perceived prey status from long ago.
And when that intersects with things like capitalism, colonialism.
It creates a powerful system where the group designated as other in this historical context, Black populations, becomes a sort of focal point for projecting those deep-seated, maybe unconscious fears and anxieties.
So it reframes the why of prejudice, not just why dislike this group, but what underlying fear in my group's history might be driving this.
Exactly. It shifts the focus inward towards the potential anxieties of the dominant group, suggesting those need to be addressed to truly dismantle the prejudice.
But, and this is crucial, this absolutely doesn't excuse or justify any kind of racism or oppression.
Not in any way. It's offered purely as a potential layer of understanding the origins or the persistence of these dynamics, not as a justification for them.
Okay. The discussion then pivots a bit, looking at our species origins. Homo sapiens out of Africa, other human species going extinct. Was our lineage just, better predators?
Well, the current science suggests it's more complex than just being the top predator. Homo sapiens' success, originating in Africa, likely came from a mix of things.
Like what?
Greater adaptability to different climates, probably more sophisticated social cooperation, advanced language, better tools, maybe more flexible thinking. And there's also the factor of interbreeding with other groups like Neanderthals, absorbing them in a way.
So the out-of-Africa model means we all share that African root. But what about the genetic admixture in non-African populations from Neanderthals or Denisovans? Does that make them fundamentally other?
No, not fundamentally. All modern humans are genetically rooted in Africa. That later admixture outside Africa is relatively small and represents adaptations or interactions in specific regions. It doesn't create deep biological divides.
So the whole concept of race as some pure biological division is just wrong.
Scientifically, yes. In fact, African populations often show the most genetic diversity, reflecting that longer, more continuous lineage back to our species' origin. Race is a much more recent, surface-level concept, often tied to superficial adaptations like skin color.
But survival wasn't purely kumbaya, right? If our ancestors thrived and others didn't, there had to be competition, maybe conflict.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
If we strip away any romantic notions, early Homo sapiens were incredibly effective survivors, and that almost certainly involved competition for food, for territory, for mates, and yes, likely violence between groups as well. They were, from a purely biological standpoint, very successful survival machines.
Okay, bringing this back to the racial dynamic then. If the African gene pool represents this sort of foundational, unbroken line of survival, could populations that emerged later, adapted to different places, maybe carry some kind of subconscious anxiety about that, about being, in a sense, derivative?
That's the really provocative suggestion being explored. Could there be a deep, maybe unconscious awareness of not being the original model, so to speak? A latent fear of being somehow less biologically robust or adaptable in the grand scheme of things, leading to a drive to assault dominance.
Which leads to the most unsettling part of this hypothesis. Could something as horrific as mass enslavement have roots, not just in economics or power, but in this deep ancestral fear, associating darker skin with that original, perhaps perceived as more adaptable, lineage, and seeing it as a long-term threat?
That's the speculative leap. That subjugation becomes a kind of preemptive strategy driven by an unconscious fear of being biologically outcompeted by a group perceived, on some deep level, as having greater inherent survival fitness or resilience.
A strategy enacted by a group, perhaps feeling, again, unconsciously less secure in its own long-term biological standing.
That's the proposed psychological undercurrent. And, as the material points out, controlling people intellectually, ideologically, making them believe they are inferior, can be a much more effective and lasting form of control than just physical force.
Right. So then modern systemic inequality, you look at biases baked into education systems, economic opportunities, the legal system, how media portrays groups. Could these be seen as the current tools of that same deeply evolved strategy?
That's the argument, that these institutions aren't necessarily acting out of overt conscious malice in every instance, but they function perhaps as manifestations of this historical drive to maintain control, to create internalized barriers, to perpetuate that dominance.
Wow. Okay, if these patterns are potentially that deep, running back through evolution and ancestral memory, is there any realistic way to transcend them? The source talks about reconditioning.
Yes, the idea of transcendence hinges on conscious effort, on actively reconditioning ourselves and our societies. It's presented as a multi-level process.
What levels are we talking about?
It involves things like deliberately challenging and changing the harmful stories and narratives we tell ourselves, engaging in collective healing processes for past traumas, building more decentralized power structures to break up old hierarchies, and even exploring things like neurobiological counterconditioning, basically. Retraining our brain's fear responses.
Are there signs this is even possible? Any real-world examples of this kind of ancestral memory reframing?
The discussion does point to some examples. Think about the rise of Afrocentric education, which deliberately recenters African history and achievements, or the global resurgence and influence of African spiritual traditions, art, music, reclaiming and celebrating that heritage.
So ways of actively pushing back against negative narratives and reclaiming a positive sense of ancestral connection.
Exactly. These are seen as signs that such reframing and transcendence is achievable, that people are already doing it.
But what about our basic wiring? If there's this potential biological underpinning for fear, for distinguishing us versus them for survival, can we really choose empathy and collaboration instead?
Well, the evidence suggests we absolutely can. Neurobiologically, we're equipped for connection too. Chemicals like oxytocin foster bonding and trust. We have mirror neurons that help us feel what others feel, the basis of empathy.
So it's not all fear and competition.
No. While fear might trigger older, more primal brain regions, things like collaboration, moral reasoning, empathy, they involve the prefrontal cortex, our more advanced processing center. It suggests we can consciously moderate those primal fear responses, especially with practice and supportive environments.
And the source mentions cultural examples too, like Ubuntu philosophy.
Right, Ubuntu, which emphasizes interconnectedness, I am because we are. Also things like truth and reconciliation commissions after conflicts, trying to heal divisions, and historical examples of cross-racial solidarity movements fighting for common causes.
So these show it's possible when the structures and narratives encourage it.
Precisely. They demonstrate that while fear might be a powerful instinct, humans definitely have the capacity for cooperation and overcoming division, especially when our social systems support it.
The role of myth and ritual also came up. How do they fit in?
Myths and rituals are ancient tools for shaping collective understanding and behavior. They encode our deepest beliefs, our memories. Sometimes archetypes within myths, like the shadow or the enemy, can reinforce seeing other groups negatively.
But that could be changed.
That's the idea. We can consciously choose to reinterpret old myths or create new stories and rituals that emphasize unity, shared humanity, interconnectedness. It's about using these powerful tools to rewire our collective psyche in a positive direction.
So it's a combination of individual work, changing narratives, and redesigning the systems themselves.
Absolutely. Education systems that teach inclusive history, economic systems that promote equity, media that reflects diverse perspectives, governance that ensures representation. All these structural changes are crucial for cultivating trust and counteracting those old patterns of fear and division.
It sounds like a huge project. What would this global reconditioning blueprint actually look like?
The discussion outlines several interconnected elements. There's the neurobiological level practices like mindfulness or therapy to manage fear responses. There's cultural reclamation valuing diverse histories and wisdom. Structural redesign, building equitable institutions. Narrative transformation, changing the stories we tell. And fostering global collaboration, connecting different movements working towards these goals.
It's comprehensive. And what's the ultimate driver for this massive shift? Is it just because the right thing to do?
Well, the conclusion suggests it might be more than just ethics. It argues that our actual biological imperative might be shifting. Facing global crises, climate change, pandemics, resource scarcity requires unprecedented cooperation.
The old competitive group versus group model won't cut it anymore.
It might actually be maladaptive now. The argument is that species survival, our species survival, increasingly depends on moving beyond fear and competition towards collaboration and sustainability. It's becoming an evolutionary necessity.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, we've really journeyed through a complex and sometimes unsettling idea that today's systemic inequalities, especially racial ones, might echo deep evolutionary survival strategies and ancestral fears.
We looked at the predator-prey idea as a metaphor, considered how ancestral memory might play a role, touched on our genetic origins, and how these might unconsciously shape group dynamics.
So we also explored the flip side, our very real capacity for transcendence, the potential to consciously recondition ourselves and our societies through psychological, cultural, and systemic change.
Right, drawing on evidence from neuroscience, cultural practices, and social movements.
Which leaves us, and you the listener, with a pretty profound question to mull over. Can our species consciously choose to evolve beyond this potential predator-prey paradigm, this legacy of ancestral fear? Can we actually build a future based on partnership and shared well-being? Not just because it sounds nice, but because our survival might actually depend on it.
It's a huge question, with no easy answers. But exploring these deeper roots, as we've tried to do based on the source material, feels like a necessary step.
Definitely food for thought. We hope this exploration has given you a unique perspective and perhaps sparked some new connections. Understanding these deep currents is vital as we continue trying to navigate and improve our shared world.